I spent 45 years constructing a future for my family, but my son and his wife acted as though everything I owned was already theirs. At Easter dinner, she came at me after I refused to let her broke parents move into my house. Wine and blood ran down my face. I never shouted or fought back. I only checked my watch. It was 7:14 p.m. That was the moment I decided they would never inherit another penny from me. This nightmare didn't begin with a bang, but with the clinking of silverware in my dining room. The air was thick with the smell of slow-roasted pork loin with sage and garlic, a recipe my late wife used to make. I sat at the head of this walnut table, a table I had crafted with my own hands 30 years ago. To my right sat Derek, my only son. Welcome to Alpha Dad Stories. I'm glad you found your way here today. If this is your first time, tap subscribe so you don't miss the next story when it comes out. Before we begin, I'd love to know, when you sit down with a story like this one, what are you hoping to carry away with you? A reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself or something else entirely. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. One quick note before we get into it. This story contains fictional elements woven in for the sake of the telling, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental, but the message at the heart of it is as real as it gets. To my left sat Vanessa, his wife slowly swirling her wine glass with a look of calculated distress etched across her face. The conversation had been light, too light. I recognized that tone. It was the quiet before the ask. Usually it was a new car lease or a vacation to the Maldives, because Vanessa was feeling burnt out from her part-time work as a lifestyle blogger, but tonight had a different weight to it. Vanessa let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind designed to bring all conversation to a halt. She set her glass down hard enough that the china rattled. "It is just so unfair," she said, glancing at Derek, then over at me. "Mom and Dad are in a motel tonight, Jerry. A motel. Can you imagine?" I took a slow, measured bite of my dinner. I knew her parents, the Dunbars. They were people who spent money they didn't have to impress people they didn't like. "I am sorry to hear that," I said, keeping my voice even. "I thought they sold the house in Florida for a good profit." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "There were complications, Jerry. The market is terrible. They'd lost nearly everything. Nowhere left to go." I felt my jaw tighten. I had heard talk that the Dunbars had been living large down south, boats, new trucks, the whole performance. If they were broke, the market had nothing to do with it. It was their own doing. Derek cleared his throat. He looked pale, nervous. He wouldn't hold my gaze. "Dad, we were thinking, since you have so much space here. I mean, the house is enormous." "Here it comes," I thought. Vanessa leaned in, her voice going honey sweet. "The east wing is completely empty, Jerry. 2 bedrooms, a private bath, its own entrance. It would be perfect for them just until they find their footing." I set my fork down. The east wing. That was the addition I had built for my wife when she fell ill so she could look out at the garden she loved. It was her sanctuary. Since she passed, I had kept it exactly as it was. A place of memory, not a way station for grifters. "No," I said. Simple. Direct. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa blinked as though she hadn't heard me right. "Excuse me." I said it again. "No." I picked up my wine glass. "I am not running a hotel, Vanessa. I put in 45 years in construction, grinding through frozen Philadelphia winters and brutal summer heat. I built this house for my family, for my wife. I did not build it to shelter 2 reckless adults who burned through their own retirement." Derek's hand came down on the table. "Dad, come on. That is incredibly harsh. They are family." "They are her family, Derek," I corrected him. And you know as well as I do that Wayne and Connie Dunbar have never broken a sweat in their lives. If they need money, they can find work. But they are not moving into the East Wing. The color rising in Vanessa's face was a near match for the wine in her glass. "You are unbelievable," she hissed. "You sit here in this mansion all by yourself, hoarding rooms you never even set foot in." "My parents are suffering." I held her gaze. "I am not hoarding rooms. I am living in my home, the home I paid for, the home I pay taxes on. And frankly, Vanessa, I am tired of being the financial backstop for everyone at this table." That was the spark. Derek shoved back his chair, the legs screaming against the floor as he rose. "You are being selfish," he snapped, his voice cracking. "Always the same with you, isn't it? Your money, your house, your rules. You have 5 empty bedrooms. What are you saving them for, ghosts?" The disrespect landed harder than I cared to show. I looked at my son. I saw a man of 40 who still carried himself like a boy of 14. A man whose tuition I had paid, whose car insurance I still covered, whose mortgage down payment had come from my pocket. "I am saving them for peace and quiet," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady rumble. "And if you think I am selfish, try paying your own bills for a month." Vanessa got to her feet. She was shaking not from grief, but from raw, uncut fury. She reached for her wine glass. It was a large crystal goblet filled to the brim with an expensive Cabernet. "You act like you are some kind of king," she shrieked. "You are just a bitter, lonely old man." And then she threw it. Not a toss. She threw the glass. I saw it coming and couldn't move. The crystal goblet caught me squarely above the left eyebrow. It didn't glance off. It shattered. The crack of it rang through the quiet dining room like a shot. Shards scattered across the table. For a moment I felt nothing. Then a sharp, searing heat split across my forehead. I sat there stunned. Warm, sticky liquid began running down my face. It seeped into my left eye, stinging, clouding my vision. I could taste it on my lips. Iron and tannins, blood and wine. Derek sucked in a breath. "Oh my God, Vanessa." Vanessa stood there, chest heaving, her hand still half raised. For a fraction of a second, she looked horrified, but then her expression hardened back. "Look what you made me do," she muttered. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. The commotion in the room seemed to slow to a crawl. I reached into my pocket and drew out a handkerchief. I pressed it against my forehead. It soaked through in seconds, going deep crimson. I turned back my cuff and looked at my watch. It was a rugged field watch I had bought myself when I retired. The glowing hands read 7:14 p.m. I fixed that time in my mind. 7:14 p.m. The moment my family died. I rose slowly. My chair didn't make a sound. I felt a coldness moving through my chest, icing over whatever warmth I had kept for them. "Where are you going?" Derek asked, his voice unsteady. "Dad, you are bleeding. We need to clean that up." I walked past him toward the hallway where my keys hung. "I am going to the emergency room," I said. My own voice sounded foreign to me, flat, detached. Derek moved ahead and planted himself at the front door, arms spread wide. "Dad, stop. You cannot go out like that. You are in shock. Let us just settle down. Vanessa didn't mean it. It was an accident." I looked at him. I looked at the blood on his shirt from where he had tried to grab me. "An accident is when you drop a glass, Derek," I said. "Hurling a projectile at someone's head is assault." Derek's eyes went wide. "Assault, Dad, don't be crazy. You are not going to the police. You are not leaving until you sit down and talk this through." He held his ground, thinking he could back me down. He had forgotten who I was. He'd forgotten that before I was an old man in a good suit. I was a man who hauled 80 lb bags of cement up ladders for a living. The grip strength hadn't left me. I stepped forward and took Derek by the shoulder. I didn't shove him. I simply moved him. I pressed into his collarbone and swept him aside like he was made of paper. "Get out of my way," I growled, "or I will add unlawful imprisonment to the list of charges." Derek stumbled back, his face a map of shock. He had never seen me like this. He had never seen what lived underneath the quiet exterior. I pulled open the heavy oak door and walked out into the cool night air. My forehead was throbbing now, a steady pounding beat of pain. I made my way to my truck, my trusty old F-150 that I kept perfectly maintained. As I turned the engine over, I caught Derek and Vanessa framed in the doorway. Vanessa was crying now, the full weight of what she had done settling over her. Derek was shouting something, but the window glass swallowed his voice whole. I didn't look back. I put the truck in gear and rolled down the long driveway. By the time I turned onto the main road, the adrenaline had begun to drain away, replaced by a cold, precise clarity. My head was bleeding, but my thinking had never been sharper. They assumed this was just a fight, that I would cool down, come home, and write a check to smooth everything over the way I always had. They were wrong. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't 911 I dialed. Not yet. I pulled up my messages and found the name Frank Delacroix, my attorney, and the oldest friend I had. My fingers, slick with blood, typed out a message that would set the rest of my life in motion. Phase 1 complete. Vanessa assaulted me, going to ER. I hit send. The screen cast a pale glow in the darkness of the cab. I wasn't just a wounded man driving to the hospital. I was a general putting his forces in the field. And as the lights of the emergency room came into view ahead, one thing was certain. The Easter dinner was over, but the real carving was just about to begin. The interior of my F-150 was silent, except for the hum of tires on asphalt and the steady rhythmic throb of blood in my temples. I glanced down at the passenger seat. A single dark red drop had landed on the clean beige leather. It irritated me more than the gash above my eye. Leather could be cleaned, but the stain of what had just happened back at that house was permanent. I pulled a napkin from the center console and pressed it to the seat, my movements deliberate and controlled despite the pain now radiating behind my eyes. Most men in my position would be unraveling, speeding, running lights, hyperventilating into their phone while they dialed 911. But I was not most men. I was a man who had spent 40 years calculating structural loads and forecasting failure points. I knew precisely how much stress a beam could absorb before it gave way. And I knew precisely how much pressure my family could sustain before it turned violent. Tonight, the beam had finally given way. I did not head straight for the hospital entrance. I turned into a side street 2 blocks out and put the truck in park. The street lamp above threw a sickly yellow wash into the cab. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The cut was deep, ragged, and ugly. It ran from just below the hairline down to the middle of my brow. My left eye was already beginning to swell shut. Good. It looked awful. It looked like exactly what it was, a vicious assault on an elderly man. I took out my phone. My hands were steady. I navigated to my encrypted messaging app and found the thread with Frank Delacroix. Frank had been my attorney since the 80s. He was the only man I trusted to bury a body, though in this case what we were burying was my son's future. I typed 3 sentences. Phase 1 complete. Vanessa assaulted me. Going to ER. I watched the 3 dots pulse for a moment before the message showed as read. A reply came back almost immediately. Document everything. Do not wash the shirt. I will meet you there in 20 minutes. I put the phone away. Phase 1. It sounded cold when I let the words sit, but they had forced my hand. This was not some impulsive reaction. This was the end point of 6 months of hell. As I eased the truck back into gear and drove toward the glow of the emergency room, my mind pulled back to where it all started. It began with small things. A gold cufflink gone missing here, $100 disappearing from my wallet there. I had assumed I was becoming forgetful, that maybe age was finally catching up. But then I put in the audio recorders. Not cameras, just small, high-fidelity voice recorders tucked behind the bookshelves and under the coffee table. I remember sitting in my office late one night, headphones on, listening to Vanessa and Derek talk about me while they thought I was asleep. They did not speak of me with love. They spoke of me like I was an obstacle. I heard Vanessa call me a senile old miser. I heard Derek laugh and agree, saying I couldn't hold the purse strings forever. They were waiting for me to die. When it became clear they weren't just ungrateful, but actively predatory, I went to Frank. We looked at the options. Evicting them would be messy. Cutting off the money would trigger tantrums and possibly elder abuse lawsuits claiming I lacked mental capacity. No, Frank had said. If you want them gone, really gone, you need cause. You need them to cross a line the law cannot overlook. You need a criminal act. So I waited. I made myself difficult. I said no to small requests. I picked at Vanessa's spending. I prodded the bear, knowing that sooner or later the bear would swing. And tonight, with a wine glass to the face, Vanessa had handed me the golden ticket. I pulled up to the emergency room entrance and left the truck in the drop-off lane, not giving a thought to parking rules. Let them tow it. I walked through the sliding glass doors, the fluorescent light stinging my eyes. The triage nurse glanced up with the blank look of someone deep into a long shift, until she saw the blood soaking the entire left side of my face and shirt. Her eyes went wide. "Sir, are you okay? What happened?" I leaned against the desk and let my shoulders sag, let the exhaustion come through. I needed to look the part. "I am not sure," I said, my voice rough and low. "My daughter-in-law." She threw a glass. It hit me. The nurse was on her feet in an instant. "Code gray to triage," she said into her radio, coming around the counter to steer me into a wheelchair. "We need to get you back right now." The next hour came in fragments. They wheeled me into a private bay. A young doctor with worn-out eyes examined the wound and let out a low whistle. "That is a nasty one, Mr. Callahan. You are going to need quite a few stitches. We need to clean this out carefully to make sure there is no glass embedded in the tissue." I nodded. "Do what you have to do." The cleaning was worse than the impact itself. The antiseptic burned like fire, but I was glad for it. It kept me sharp. It kept me angry. As the doctor began to close the wound, drawing the skin together with black nylon thread, a police officer stepped into the room. Young, maybe 30, buzz-cut notepad in hand. "Officer Novak," he said, "the nurse called this in as a domestic assault. Can you tell me what happened tonight?" I looked at him. I did not see a young man. I saw a tool, a weapon I could put to use. I drew a slow breath. My son and his wife were at my home for Easter dinner. I kept my voice steady, factual. There was a disagreement about money. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa Callahan, became enraged when I refused to allow her parents to move into my house. She picked up a heavy crystal wine glass and threw it at my head from roughly 4 feet away. It was not accidental. She looked directly at me, screamed insults, and then threw it with force. The officer was writing fast. "And your son Derek, did he participate?" I paused. That was the hard part. Derek had not thrown the glass, but he had blocked the door. He had tried to stop me from leaving. He had stood by while his wife mistreated me for months. He is an accessory, I said evenly. He prevented me from leaving the premises after I had been injured. He attempted to physically detain me. I had to push my way out. The doctor tied off the last stitch. 9 stitches. Officer Novak looked up from his notepad. Mr. Callahan, given the severity of your injury and the fact that you are over 65, this falls under felony elder abuse statutes in this state. Do you wish to press charges? The room went still. The doctor stopped tidying his instruments. The nurse held her position near the door. Everyone waiting for the answer. Most parents would shield their children. Most would say it was a mistake, that they didn't want to ruin anyone's life. But my life had already been damaged. My sanctuary violated. My trust destroyed. I looked Officer Novak in the eye. I want to press full charges against Vanessa Callahan for assault with a deadly weapon and elder abuse. I also want to file for an immediate emergency restraining order against both Vanessa and Derek Callahan. I do not want either of them within 500 FT of me or my property. Officer Novak gave a single grim nod. I understand. We take this very seriously. I will need to photograph your injuries for the record. After that, we will dispatch a unit to your residence. I nodded and sat up straighter as he raised the camera. Flash, flash, flash. Every burst of light was a nail in their coffin. When he finished, I asked the question that had been burning in my chest since I'd left the house. What happens now? Officer Novak holstered the camera and keyed his radio. He looked at me with something between pity and respect. Now, Mr. Callahan, we go pick her up. Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have a confirmed felony assault at the ER. Victim has requested charges. Suspect is at the residence. Send a unit to apprehend. I listened to the crackle of the radio, the dispatcher's voice coming back to confirm. A cold, heavy satisfaction settled in my gut. They were probably still at the house, bickering, maybe trying to mop up the wine, thinking they had time to put together a story. They thought I was just an old man licking his wounds. They had no idea the sirens they were about to hear were not coming to help them. They were coming to finish them. I eased back against the stiff hospital pillow and closed my eyes. The pain in my head was still there, but it was manageable now. Frank would be here soon with the paperwork. Phase 1 was indeed complete. The trap had been sprung. Now we just had to watch them thrash. The silence in the hospital waiting room was broken only by the hum of the vending machine and the distant murmur of nurses at their station. I sat there, a fresh bandage throbbing on my forehead, eyes fixed on my phone. I knew exactly what was unfolding across town at my house. I could picture it with the precision of a man who had built that structure from the ground up. By now, Derek and Vanessa would be in full panic. On their hands and knees, scrubbing the hardwood floors with bleach racing to erase the red wine and the blood before it set into the grain. They were not cleaning up a spill. They were destroying evidence. They probably thought they had gotten away with it. They likely told themselves the old man was being dramatic, that I would drive around for an hour and come home apologizing for making a scene. They had no idea a patrol car was already turning onto our streetlights, cut to avoid detection until the last possible second. My phone buzzed against the hard plastic armrest. A text from Officer Novak. Units have arrived. We are executing the warrant. A cold, settled satisfaction moved through my chest, not happiness. It was the feeling of a structural engineer watching a controlled demolition. I had planted the charges. Now gravity was doing the rest. I closed my eyes and pictured what was happening. I knew that Vanessa's parents, the Dunbars, were scheduled to arrive right about now. They would be pulling up in their rental car, luggage in hand, expecting a warm welcome and a free room in the East Wing. Instead, they were walking into a crime scene. I could almost hear the bewilderment in their voices as they came through the front door, their daughter standing there with a rag in her hand and panic in her eyes. Then my phone rang. Derek's name lit up the screen. I let it ring. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. I wanted him to feel the desperation. I wanted him to sit with the possibility that I might not be alive. Finally, on the last ring, I swiped green and held the phone to my ear. I said nothing. I just listened. Dad. Dad, pick up. Oh my God. The voice on the other end was high and cracking, edging toward hysteria. The voice of a boy, not a man. Dad, are you there? You have to stop this. The police are here. They are everywhere. I settled back in the chair, my voice level and quiet, a cold contrast to his panic. I know, Derek. I sent them. A pause, then the sound of chaos bleeding through from the background. A radio crackling. Vanessa shrieking that shrill, indignant pitch I had heard too many times across the last 10 years. Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am? My father is a lawyer. Then Derek came back on the line, breathless. You sent them. Are you out of your mind? They are arresting Vanessa. She is in cuffs, Dad. Locked in cuffs. Her parents just walked in. Wayne and Connie are standing there watching their daughter get treated like a criminal. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? I looked at the blood drying on my shirt cuff. Humiliating, I repeated. You want to discuss humiliation? Derek, humiliation is having a wine glass thrown into your face in your own home. Humiliation is being called selfish for protecting what you worked for from people who want to take it. Humiliation is bleeding onto your dinner while your son plants himself at the door to keep you from leaving. Derek wasn't listening. He was too consumed with his own misery. This is a misunderstanding. She slipped. The glass slipped. You cannot put my wife in jail over a broken glass. You need to tell them to stop. Tell them you fell. Tell them anything. I let out a short, dry laugh. It pulled at the stitches, but I couldn't help it. You want me to lie to the police, Derek? You want me to commit a crime to cover up hers? That is precisely how we ended up here. You have lived your whole life believing there are no consequences. You think because I paid for your college, your car, your down payment that I will pay for this too. But I cannot write a check to make this disappear. In the background, I heard Officer Novak's voice, firm and measured. Ma'am, stop resisting or we will add a charge. You have the right to remain silent. Derek's voice cracked wide open. Dad, please. She is crying. They are pulling her out to the car. The neighbors are all watching. Mrs. Waverly is on her porch. Our reputation is finished. Your reputation, I said. My reputation is perfectly intact. In fact, I suspect people will finally understand why I have looked so worn down these last few years. Derek came apart. You are a monster. You are a vindictive, senile old man. You are doing this just to hurt us. You are doing this because you are lonely and miserable, and you want everyone around you to be miserable too. I sat up straight. The moment had arrived. I had held this card tight against my chest for months, waiting for exactly the right time to lay it down. And I am not doing this because I am lonely, Derek. I said, my voice dropping an octave, going hard as poured concrete. I am doing this because I am finished being your bank account, and I am finished being lied to. What are you talking about? Derek snapped. No, I am talking about the $20,000, Derek. The line went dead. The noise in the background seemed to fall away. The only sound left was Derek's unsteady breathing. I pressed on, letting each word land like a nail driven home. I know about the online gambling, Derek. I know about the debt you ran up on the sports betting apps. I know you borrowed money from your wife's parents to cover the interest, which is why they are broke and needed to move in with me. And I know you have been siphoning from the household account I set up for groceries, trying to win it back. Dad, Derek stumbled. I can explain. It was just a bad streak. I was going to pay it back. No, you were not, I said. You were going to move the Dunbars into my house so you could use their presence rent-free to cover your tracks. You were going to turn my home into a refuge for your failures. The disrespect tonight had nothing to do with the house. It was because you were cornered. You were desperate, and you took it out on me. Derek was sobbing now, a broken, hollow sound. Dad, please. I am in over my head. If Vanessa goes to jail, her parents will find out everything. They will destroy me. You have to help me. Just this once. I looked at the exit sign above the hospital doors. It burned a steady, hopeful red. See, I have helped you every single day of your life, Derek, I said. And look what it brought me. A scar on my face and a son who calls me a monster. I am done helping. You are a grown man. Work it out. But where will you go? Derek asked, his voice unraveling. You cannot go back to the house. It is a mess. I am not going back to the house, I said. Not tonight, and not until the locks are changed and you are gone. I pulled the phone from my ear. I could still hear him on the line, shouting, pleading, begging me to wait, to listen, to try to understand, but I had understood enough. I pressed the red button and ended the call. Then I went into the settings and tapped block caller. The silence that followed was beautiful. I got to my feet, my legs steadier than I expected. I walked out through the emergency room doors and flagged down a taxi. The driver, an older man with a kind face, glanced at my bandage but asked nothing. Where to? He said. Take me to the Rittenhouse, I told him. He raised an eyebrow. The fancy one downtown. The very same, I said. The ride was smooth. I watched Philadelphia pass by outside the window, the lights smearing into long ribbons of gold and silver. I had put up buildings in this city. I had left my mark on its skyline. Now I was building something else, my own life back. When I walked into the lobby of the Rittenhouse, the concierge did not look at my blood-stained shirt with disgust. He looked at me with concern and quiet professionalism. I set my black credit card on the counter. I need a suite, I said. City view if you have it, and a bottle of your best bourbon sent up. And one more thing. Yes, Mr. Callahan. The concierge asked, fingers still moving over the keyboard. If a man named Derek Callahan calls or tries to come by, I am not here. I am not to be disturbed by anyone. Understood, sir, he said, and handed me a key card. I rode the elevator up to the 28th floor. The room was magnificent. Heavy velvet curtains, a bed that looked like a cloud, and silence. Absolute, expensive silence. I crossed to the window and looked out over the city. Somewhere down there in a police precinct, my daughter-in-law was being fingerprinted. Somewhere my son was hyperventilating in a house he could not afford to keep. I poured a glass of bourbon from the minibar. It burned, going down a clean, honest burn that matched the fire in my chest. I settled into the leather armchair and let out a long breath. Phase 1 was finished. The enemy was in retreat. But as I turned the amber liquid slowly in the glass, I knew this was only the opening move. The real war, the war for my legacy, for my company, was just getting started. And unlike Derek, I never played a hand unless I already knew the outcome. I took a slow sip and spoke into the empty room. Your move, son. The morning sun that reached the 28th floor of the Rittenhouse was not warm. It was exposing. It drove through the sheer curtains and fell directly on the manila envelope resting on the marble coffee table. I sat there in a plush bathrobe that had cost more than my first car, drinking black coffee that tasted like roasted nuts and vindication. My head pulsed with a dull, steady ache beneath the bandage, a constant reminder of the glass that had shattered my family. But the pain was beside the point. What was moving through me now was anticipation. Frank Delacroix sat across from me. He looked as crisp and composed as a new $100 bill. He did not look like a man who had spent half the night coordinating bail bonds and restraining orders. He looked like a shark in a pinstriped suit. He tapped the envelope with one manicured finger. "You are going to want to sit down for this, Jerry." Frank said, his voice stripped of any emotion. "Although you are already sitting, so maybe pour a second cup of coffee." I set my cup down. "I do not need caffeine, Frank. I need ammunition. Tell me what the investigator found." Frank opened the folder. The scrape of paper against the tabletop was the only sound in the room. He arranged 3 documents side by side, bank statements and property deeds. Routine paperwork until you looked at the numbers. "Here's the story your daughter-in-law told last night," Frank began. "Her parents, Wayne and Connie Dunbar, are destitute. The market turned on them. They lost their house in Florida. The street or your East Wing, those are their only options." I nodded. That had been the story. The tearful pitch that ended with glass in my face. Frank pointed to the first document. "This is the closing statement for the sale of their property in Sarasota. It closed 4 days ago." I leaned forward, eyes narrowing, then widening. The sale price was not a foreclosure figure. It was not a short sale. It was $650,000. "Cash," Frank added. "No mortgage to retire." After closing costs and fees, they walked away with over $620,000 in clean liquid cash. It was deposited into a joint Chase account on Tuesday. A laugh worked its way up from somewhere deep in my chest, dark, cynical, involuntary. "They have over $500,000 in the bank," I murmured, "and they are sleeping in a Motel 6 to sell the poverty story." "It gets better," Frank said, a thin smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. He slid the second document across. It was a glossy printout, an invoice from a luxury RV dealership in Orlando. "This is a purchase order dated yesterday morning," Frank explained. "For a Winnebago Horizon 40-foot diesel pusher, marble floors, king-size bed washer and dryer on board. Sticker price is $400,000. I stared at the photo of the vehicle. It was a mansion on wheels. It was finer than the first home I had ever built for myself. Shuktertine. They put down a non-refundable deposit of $15,000, Frank continued. They are set to pick it up next week. I sat back as the pieces snapped together with a sickening thud. The plan was never to live with me permanently. The plan was to use my house as a staging ground and a free base of operations. They wanted to park Vanessa's parents in my East Wing free room and board while they waited for their luxury land yacht to be ready. Once they had the RV, they were going to roll across the country on the remaining $200,000 living, without a care, while I stayed home cutting the grass and covering the utilities. I was not just a bank to them. I was the hired help. I was the unpaid caretaker holding their spot while they lived like royalty. And Derek, I asked, my voice low. Does he know? Frank shrugged. That is the million-dollar question, or rather the $600,000 question. Either he is in on it and helped them engineer this whole scheme to get them through your door, or he is the biggest fool in Philadelphia, and his wife and in-laws are running the same con on him that they tried to run on you. I turned to the window and looked out at the skyline. I thought about Derek. I thought about how he had glared at me the night before, loaded with accusation, calling me selfish. He had called me selfish for refusing to house millionaires. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Ma, it does not matter whether he knows, I said, rising and moving to the desk in the corner. He is about to find out. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed ready. I logged into my email and started a new message to Derek Callahan. Subject: the poverty plea. Scan them, I told Frank. Frank drew a portable scanner from his briefcase. Within minutes, the digital files were on my screen, the closing statement showing the cash windfall, the invoice for the luxury RV. I attached them to the message. I typed a short note. No greeting, no signature. Only facts. Derek, before you accuse me of destroying your family again, you should know exactly who you are fighting for. Your in-laws are not homeless. They are wealthier than you are. They sold their house for cash and bought a $400,000 RV. They wanted to move in to save money for gas. You are not a savior son. You are a dupe. Read the attachments, then ask your wife why she threw a glass at my face to protect a lie. I held my finger over the send button. This was the moment. The moment I pulled the excuse out from under him. He could no longer stand on the moral high ground. He could no longer claim he was simply looking out for family. I clicked send. The soft whoosh of the departing email was almost nothing. The impact would be nuclear. I settled back onto the sofa and looked at Frank. Now what? Now we wait, Frank said, snapping his briefcase shut. If he has any backbone left, he will leave her. If he has any sense left, he will apologize to you. I checked my watch. 10:00 a.m. Derek would be at the police station by now, or maybe sitting with a bail bondsman trying to scrape together 10% of whatever the judge had set for Vanessa. He would check his phone. He always checked his phone when the pressure was on. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The silence in the hotel suite stretched taut as a piano wire. I expected the phone to ring. I expected him to call in screaming that it was fabricated or sobbing that he had no idea. I anticipated the denial. I braced for the rage. But the phone stayed dark. 30 minutes. The silence began to change. It stopped being expectant and turned heavy, dense and suffocating. It was the silence of a man who had just realized that the ground beneath his feet was not there. It was the silence of total, devastating humiliation. He is reading it, I said quietly. He is reading it over and over. He is looking at his wife, Frank said. He is looking at her sitting in a holding cell, or maybe sitting right beside him in the car, and he is understanding that the woman he married is a stranger. Or, I said, a darker thought rising up. He is realizing that he is too weak to do anything about it. I stared at the blank screen of my phone. That silence cut deeper than the shouting the night before ever had. Shouting is engagement. Shouting means there is still a live wire between two people, however dangerous. Silence. Silence is the death of hope. He was not calling because there was nothing left to say. The truth was too large, too stark, too ugly to argue against. I refilled my coffee cup, my hand trembling just slightly. The caffeine wasn't doing a thing. That RV invoice was seared into my mind. A $400,000 plaything. And for that, for a toy, my son had been willing to watch his father bleed. Leave the file, Frank, I said. I have a feeling I'll need to go back through it. Frank nodded, got to his feet, and moved toward the door. You know how to reach me, Jerry. Step 2 is locking down the company assets. We don't want Derek doing anything reckless with the business accounts now that he knows the gravy train is finished. I didn't respond. I was still watching the phone, willing it to light up, willing my son, the one I'd raised, to call me and say he was sorry, that he was walking away from them, that he was coming back to my side. But the phone sat dark and silent. And in that quiet, it hit me the son I believed I had might be gone for good, swapped out for a man who would swallow any lie just to keep the peace with a woman who couldn't stand him. The hook was set, the lie was out in the open, but my gut told me the worst hadn't arrived yet. I turned toward the door Frank had just pulled shut behind him. I was alone in a luxury suite, the truth on my side, and utterly, completely alone. The knock came exactly 45 minutes after I sent the email. It wasn't the knock of a man with confidence. It was a timid, tentative scraping, like a dog scratching to be let in from the cold. I finished the last of my coffee, set the cup onto its saucer with a deliberate clink, and crossed to the heavy oak door. I checked the peephole. Derek was out there slumped against the doorframe as if his legs had given up on holding him upright. He looked wrecked. His shirt, always pressed to knife-edge perfection, was rumpled and half untucked. His tie was gone. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild. I unlocked the door and pulled it wide open. I didn't step back to wave him in. I stood there, a wall he had to decide to cross. He looked at me, then at the bandage on my forehead. He flinched, as if the sight of it landed on him like a blow. "Dad!" he croaked. His voice was raw, cracked down to nothing. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. Derek moved past me into the suite. He didn't register the view or the furnishings. He dropped onto the velvet sofa and buried his face in both hands. I closed the door and turned the lock. I wanted the weight of that room to settle on him. I crossed to the armchair opposite and sat down, crossing my legs. Then I waited. I've always been good at waiting. Construction teaches you that rush the foundation, and you'll be dealing with cracks for the rest of the building's life. "I read the email," Derek whispered through his fingers. He looked up at me. His face was a map of confusion and betrayal. "Is it true, the money, the RV, is any of it real?" I pointed to the folder on the table. "The documents are right there. Certified copies. Your in-laws have $650,000 sitting in a Chase bank account while you were begging me to house them. They bought a luxury vehicle worth more than your first house while you were screaming at me for being selfish." Derek reached for the papers. His hands were trembling so hard he could barely grip them. He stared at the bank statement, his eyes moving across the numbers. He looked like a man trying to read his own death certificate. "Gee, they lied to me," he said, his voice barely holding together. "They looked me straight in the eye and told me they had nothing left. Vanessa told me they were about to end up on the street." I leaned forward. "They played you, son. They spotted a weak link and they pulled on it. They knew you'd come to me. They knew you'd fight their fight. And they knew that if they cried poor long enough, you'd feel like you had no choice but to save them." Derek crushed the page in his fist. "I can't believe it. I defended them. I went to war with you for them. I thought this was the moment. I thought he'd stand up, say he was sorry, and tell me he was finished with the lies. I thought he'd ask me what it would take to repair things between us. I was wrong. I had badly underestimated how deep the dependency ran." Derek drew a long breath. He looked at me, and something in his expression shifted. The shock drained away, and what replaced it was a desperate, pleading look that made my stomach drop. "Dad, look. What they did is wrong. It's terrible. And I will deal with Wayne and Connie. I promise I'll make them leave." But what?" I asked, my voice going hard. But Vanessa is a wreck right now," he said, the words spilling out. "She's in a cell, Dad. She's terrified. She didn't know about the money, I'm sure of it. Her parents manipulated her the same way they manipulated me. She's a victim in this too. I stared at him. I felt a coldness spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She threw a glass at my face, Derek. That wasn't manipulation. That was rage. That was violence. I know, he cried, pitching forward. And she is sorry. It was a reflex. She was under enormous pressure. She thought her parents were going to be homeless. She snapped. But you can't leave her in there. You have to drop the charges. I sat back, stunned. Even with the proof of the financial con sitting right in front of him, even with my blood on his conscience, he was still choosing her. Still making excuses. You want me to drop the charges? I repeated slowly. Yes, Derek said, nodding hard. Just drop them. I'll handle the rest. I'll make sure her parents never come near your house again. We'll get counseling. Just please call the DA. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. If she ends up with a felony, it'll ruin her life. It'll ruin us. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and a memory came back to me 10 years ago. We were standing in the funeral home looking at his mother's casket. My wife, the love of my life, was gone. I was shattered, barely keeping myself vertical. And Derek wasn't crying. He was standing right beside me, whispering, "Dad, did Mom update the will about the lake house?" I remember we talked about putting it in my name for tax purposes. I had let it go at the time, written it off as grief doing the talking. But now, watching this 40-year-old man plead with me to protect the woman who had put a gash in my head, I understood the truth. Derek wasn't simply weak. He was complicit. Right and wrong didn't enter into it for him. What he cared about was comfort, the path of least resistance. He would let his wife assault me. He would let his in-laws drain me. As long as his lifestyle stayed intact, he would look the other way. He was a parasite, same as the rest of them. He just happened to share my last name. I stood up. The movement was abrupt enough that Derek flinched. "No," I said. Derek blinked. "What? No," I said again, my voice steady and flat in the quiet of the suite. "I am not dropping the charges. I am not calling the DA. Vanessa assaulted me. She drew blood. She will stand before a judge and she will face what comes next." Derek shot to his feet, his face going red. "You can't do this. You are destroying my marriage. Your marriage is already a wreck." "Derek," I shot back. "You are married to a woman who hits your father and lies about her family's finances. If you want to stay inside that burning building, that is your decision. But don't ask me to hand you a bucket of water." Derek's fists clenched at his sides. "If you don't drop the charges, I will never forgive you. I'll cut you off. You will never see your grandchildren if we ever have them." I laughed. It came out hard and short like a bark. "You're going to cut me off? Derek, take a good look at yourself. You're wearing a suit I paid for. You drove here in a Range Rover I'm making the payments on. You live in a house where I put down the deposit. You have never stood on your own 2 feet a single day in your life." Derek went still. The color drained from his face. "You want to play hardball?" I asked, walking to the desk. I picked up my phone. "Let's play. As of this morning, I have instructed my accountant to cancel every supplementary credit card issued in your name and Vanessa's name. The black Amex gone. The gas card's gone." Derek's mouth dropped open. You can't. I'm not finished." I went on, my voice without mercy. "The lease on the Range Rover is in my name. I am terminating it. You have 48 hours to return it to the dealership, or I will report it stolen. And the monthly allowance I've been sending to your joint account to cover household expenses, that ends today." Derek looked like he'd taken a fist to the stomach. He actually staggered back. "Dad, please. We have bills. We have a mortgage. We can't survive without that money." "And then get a second job," I said, cold. "Or better yet, Go ask your wealthy in-laws for a loan. They've got plenty of cash sitting around. Derek just stood there, every bit of his arrogance stripped away, his safety net gone. He looked small. He looked pathetic. "So why are you doing this?" he whispered. "Because I love you enough to stop bankrolling your ruin," I said. "And because I respect myself too much to keep paying people to abuse me. Now get out." Derek held my gaze for a long moment. He saw something in my eyes, a resolve that told him the Bank of Dad wasn't just closed for business. It had been torn down to the foundation. He turned and walked to the door. He didn't slam it. He pulled it shut softly, like a man leaving a wake. I stood in the middle of the room and listened to his footsteps recede down the hallway. My heart was in pieces, but my mind was sharp. I had just cut off my own arm to keep the body alive. It was necessary. It was survival. But as I stared at that closed door, I knew Derek wouldn't learn anything from this. He wouldn't walk away from her. He would go straight back to Vanessa. They would both blame me, and they would find another way to keep themselves afloat. I moved back to the window. I had to be ready for whatever came next. A cornered animal is dangerous enough, but a cornered animal that's developed a taste for luxury is lethal. I picked up the phone and called Frank. "He just left," I said. "Lock down the company accounts. And Frank, get a forensic accountant in. I want a full accounting of where every dollar of business money has gone over the last 2 years. "What?" Frank asked. "Because he didn't fight for me," I said, watching the traffic crawl below. "Which means he's been fighting for himself. And I have a feeling he's been fighting dirty for a long time." The silence inside my house wasn't the peaceful quiet of a man's sanctuary. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb. I pulled my truck into the garage, the engine noise bouncing off the concrete walls I had poured myself 30 years ago. For the first time in decades, the space beside me was empty. No Derek's car. No Vanessa's convertible. Gone. Frank had called me an hour earlier to let me know that Vanessa had made bail. Her parents had put up the deed to their new RV as collateral, a foolish move that made me shake my head. But the restraining order was firmly in place. They couldn't come here. They couldn't call. I was, for all practical purposes, a ghost in my own home. I walked to the front door, keys heavy in my hand. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The air was stale. The cleaning crew had done their job. The red wine stain on the dining room wall was gone. The broken crystal had been swept up and disposed of. But I could still see it. I could still trace the arc of that glass cutting through the air toward my face. I could still see the hatred in Vanessa's eyes. I pressed my fingers against the bandage on my forehead, a physical reminder that the family I thought I was building had been a demolition crew all along, waiting for the signal to bring it all down. I didn't go to the kitchen. I didn't go to the bedroom. I went straight to my office. This room was the nerve center of everything. It held the blueprints of every structure I had ever built, and the financial records that proved I had won the game I'd spent my life playing. I crossed the white oak plank floors I had laid with my own hands, kneeling for days until my knees were bruised and swollen. I knew every grain, every knot, every flaw in that wood. Which is exactly why I stopped dead in my tracks, 3 feet from the wall. There was a scratch. Not the ordinary kind, not a scuff from a chair leg or a dropped pen. This was a deep, jagged gouge cut through the finish and down into the raw wood beneath. It was fresh. The exposed wood underneath was still pale, not yet darkened from oxidation. I crouched down and ran a calloused finger along the mark. It was curved. It looked like something heavy had been dragged and then slipped sideways. I traced the path of the scratch. It pointed directly toward the large oil painting of the Philadelphia skyline that hung behind my desk. My heart began to hammer a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I stood up and stepped behind the desk. I gripped the painting's frame. It was heavy, but it swung out on its hinges without resistance. Behind it sat the wall safe. The blood left my face. The dial was battered. There were deep scratches ringing the combination lock marks left by a screwdriver or a chisel. Someone had tried to pry the faceplate clean off. They had failed, of course. It was a TL-30 rated safe engineered to resist tool attacks for 30 minutes. But the attempt was unmistakable, and it was recent. A fine dusting of metal shavings lay on the floor where the cleaners had missed it. I stared at that safe. Inside were the deeds to the construction company. Inside were the bearer bonds I had purchased back in the 90s. Inside was the original copy of my will. They hadn't just wanted to move into the East Wing. They wanted everything. A sickening clarity settled over me. The blow-up at Easter dinner wasn't where this had started. It was the distraction. While Vanessa was screaming at me while Derek was blocking the doorway, had they already planned to come back here later? Or had they tried this days ago when I was out on a job site? I swung the painting back into place. The rage I felt now was nothing like the anger from that dinner. That had been hot, explosive, volcanic. This was cold. This was the measured, calculating focus of a man who has just discovered a thief already inside the walls. I picked up the phone from my desk. I didn't dial Derek. I called the one man who could lock this place down tight. "Sal," I said when he answered. "It's Jerry. I need you at my house in 20 minutes. Bring the commercial-grade hardware." Sal was a locksmith I'd worked with on commercial sites for 20 years. He didn't waste time with the questions. He just wanted to know what was needed. "I want everything changed," I told him. "Every exterior door, every interior lock. And Sal, I want biometric scanners on the master bedroom and the office. Fingerprint only. No keys, no codes. If it doesn't read my pulse, it doesn't open." "One more thing," I added, eyes moving to the bookshelf. "I need cameras, the concealed ones, the kind we used at the warehouse during that internal theft situation. I want them covering every common room and 2 in the office. Today." By the time Sal arrived, I was already moving through the house, checking every window, every latch. I felt like a stranger inside the home I had built with my own hands. Every shadow seemed to be hiding something. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a betrayal, while Sal drilled into the door frames, fitting high-security deadbolts that snapped shut with the solid finality of a prison cell locking. I sat at my desk, with my mind running hard. If they had gone after the safe, they were desperate for documents or for cash. Cash. Derek held the title of CEO at my company, but I still controlled the majority shares. He did, however, have signing authority over the operating accounts. I had handed that to him 5 years ago, a gesture of trust, a way to let him feel like a man of consequence. I should have known better. I grabbed the phone again. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the sharp, focused energy of a man closing in on the truth. I dialed Frank. Frank picked up immediately. "I'm working through the restraining order paperwork. Did something happen? They tried the safe, Frank." I kept my voice low. "What?" "I found tool marks on the wall safe. Someone took a chisel to it. They were after the deeds, Frank. Or the bonds." A beat of silence on the line. "That changes the picture," Frank said. "That's attempted burglary. We can add it to the charges." "Forget the charges for a minute," I snapped. "Frank, if they were desperate enough to attack a steel safe inside my own house, what else have they touched? I need you to open the company books. Right now. Not the quarterly summaries Derek sends me. I want the raw transaction logs straight from the bank. Every dollar that has moved in or out of Kowalski Construction over the last 24 months. "Jerry, it's late. The banks are closed." I don't care, I said, and my voice came out harder than I intended. Use your online access. You have this power of attorney. Log in. Pull up the operating account. Pull up the reserve fund. Pull up everything. I heard Frank begin typing in the background. Okay, I'm in. Give me some time to get through the ledgers, there's a lot of data here. No, call me the second you find anything, I said. Anything at all, Frank. Even a $10 discrepancy. What comes next stopped me cold the first time I put it all together. Because it wasn't just betrayal, it was something far darker, far more calculated than I had let myself believe. Before we get there, tell me this: if you suspected someone close to you was working against you in secret, would you confront them in the moment or quietly build your case until the truth was undeniable? I hung up. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. I watched Sal install the camera's tiny pinhole lenses tucked into the eye of a deer mount, the spine of a book, the housing of a smoke detector. I watched him program my fingerprint into the new lock on the office door. The scanner beeped green, accepting me as the master. I settled into the leather chair and stared at the silent phone. The sun was going down, throwing long, jagged shadows across the room. The scratch on the floor seemed almost to glow in the fading light, a scar carved into the face of everything I'd built. I thought about Derek. I thought about the little boy who used to trail behind me on job sites wearing a plastic hard hat. I thought about the teenager who begged me for a car. I thought about the grown man who stood there and did nothing while his wife came at me with a glass. Was he capable of this? Was he capable of stealing from the very company that had put food on his table his entire adult life? The phone rang. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. I had it off the cradle before the first ring finished. Frank's voice was different. Gone was the polished confidence of a lawyer. What replaced it was the hushed, careful tone of a friend who is about to deliver news that can't be taken back. Tell me, I said. Jerry, you need to sit down. I am sitting, Frank. Spit it out. We have a problem, Frank said. A serious one. I've been going through the operating account for the last 2 years. There are withdrawals, Jerry. Hundreds of them. Withdrawals for what materials? Labor. No, Frank said. These are cash withdrawals, ATM limits maxed out every single day, checks made out to shell companies that don't exist, and wire transfers to offshore accounts that read like online gambling sites. On how much? The numbness started in my fingertips and moved up both arms. Frank exhaled a sound of pure, unvarnished disbelief. Jerry, the reserve fund is nearly wiped out. The operating capital is down to fumes. I'm still adding it up, but at a glance, we're looking at over $250,000. The room tilted. $250,000. My retirement cushion. The company's safety net. The money I had set aside for the storms that always come eventually. This wasn't a storm. This was a hurricane. He didn't just break my heart, Frank, I whispered into the phone. He broke the bank. I looked at the camera lens concealed in the bookshelf, its red light blinking at a slow, steady pulse. I was setting up surveillance on an empty room while the real crime had already been signed, sealed, and delivered with my son's name on it. Get the forensic accountant, I said, my voice sounding like gravel scraping concrete. And Frank, don't tell Derek we know. Not yet. Why? Frank asked. Because, I said, eyes fixed on the battered safe. I am going to set a trap, and I want to see if he walks into it. The digital clock on the office wall read 2 hours a.m., but neither Frank nor I had so much as yawned. The coffee pot on the side table sat empty, A dark ring dried at the bottom, the only physical evidence of the fuel that had carried us through the night. The air in the room was thick and close-heavy, with the smell of old paper and something metallic that I can only describe as the scent of betrayal. We weren't studying blueprints. We weren't planning the future of Kowalski construction. We were standing over a crime scene laid out row by sickening row across Frank's laptop screen. Frank adjusted his glasses. The blue glow of the monitor caught in the lenses and making him look hollow-faced, almost ghostly. He hadn't spoken in 10 minutes, just clicking, scrolling, and every so often releasing a short, sharp exhale of disbelief. I sat across from him, both hands gripping the armrests of my leather chair so hard my knuckles had gone white. I was the 51% owner of this company. I had built it from a pickup truck and a toolbox into a multi-million-dollar operation. I believed I knew where every nail and every beam had gone. I was wrong. "Look here, Jerry." Frank said, his voice low and almost gentle, the way a doctor sounds when the diagnosis is terminal. He rotated the laptop toward me and highlighted a row in yellow. "Project 404, he read. "Roof repair and structural reinforcement at the residential property on the corner of Broad and Locust. Invoice dated last November. Amount $12,500. I stared at the screen. The numbers were clean and precise. The invoice looked every bit legitimate, company logo, vendor number, Derek's digital signature authorizing the payment. There was just one problem. "I know," Frank said, watching my face. I know the problem," I said quietly, closing my eyes. I didn't need to look up the property records. I knew the corner of Broad and Locust. It was a vacant lot. We had torn down a condemned building there 3 years ago and sold the parcel to the city for a park that was never built. There was no roof. There was no structure. Just a patch of weeds and compacted dirt. He paid $12,500 to repair thin air. I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fury and grief I couldn't separate. "And it's not the only one," Frank said, pulling the screen back toward himself. He began to scroll. The yellow highlights kept appearing again and again, like warning lights blinking across a dashboard. "Here's a basement waterproofing job in Chestnut Hill. $9,000. We haven't worked in Chestnut Hill since 2009. Here's an electrical upgrade for a warehouse in Norristown. $14,000. He paused. "Always just under the $15,000 threshold, Jerry." I nodded slowly. I had set that threshold myself. I had told Derek that as CEO he had full autonomy over any expense under 15 grand, anything above that required my countersignature. I thought I was empowering him. I thought I was grooming him for leadership. Instead, I had handed him the perfect ceiling for his theft. He had been skimming just below the wire, bleeding the company one small cut at a time. "What's the total?" I asked. I needed to hear the number out loud. I needed to feel the full weight of it land. Frank drew a long breath. He tapped a few keys, and a bold figure appeared at the bottom of the spreadsheet. "Over the last 24 months, he said, the total authorized payments to these phantom vendors come to $250,043. $250,000. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. That was $250,000. That was the retirement nest egg I'd been building for my foreman, Sal. That was the new equipment we needed heading into the spring season. That was my blood, my sweat, my decades stolen by the boy I had taught to ride a bike. "Where did it go?" I asked. "The money didn't just disappear, Frank. It went somewhere." Frank opened another window. He had been busy. This was exactly why I paid him the retainer I did. He had traced the routing numbers from the fictitious vendors back to a shell company called DC Premier Services, which was about as subtle as a sledgehammer. 70% went here, Frank said, pointing to a graph. An offshore account in the Caribbean. We cross-referenced it. It's a holding account tied to a high-stakes online poker site. Gambling, I muttered. He wasn't just borrowing money from the Dunbars. He was hemorrhaging it into an internet casino. And the rest, I asked. Frank hesitated. He looked uncomfortable in a way I hadn't seen from him before. The rest went to pay off credit card debt, specifically a card in Vanessa's name. I pulled the merchant codes. Jerry. It's mostly luxury retail. Be specific. Hermes, Frank said. Gucci. And a substantial charge at a cosmetic surgery clinic in Rittenhouse Square. I felt the bile climb my throat. My son had stolen $250,000 from his own father's company. He'd gambled away the majority of it, and with what remained, he'd bought designer handbags for the woman who had put a gash in my head. He had financed her lifestyle with my labor. He wasn't just a bad son. He was a predator. He was an embezzler. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the night was black and starless. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, the bandage on my forehead, the deep lines carved around my mouth. I looked like a man who had survived a war and then been knifed in the back by his own second-in-command. This is a felony, Jerry, Frank said from behind me. This is grand larceny, embezzlement, fraud. The digital trail is airtight. I can call the police right now. They can pick him up at the motel. He'll be in a cell next to his wife by sunrise. I stared into the darkness. It would be so easy. One phone call and the sirens would come again. Derek would be in handcuffs. Justice would be fast and clean. But standing there watching the security camera's red light pulse in the window's reflection, I understood something. Prison was too good for him. Prison was just a pause. If I had him arrested tonight, he would play the victim, blame the gambling, call it an addiction, claim he was sick. He'd find a lawyer who'd push for treatment instead of time. And Vanessa. She'd wait. Playing the devoted wife, living off whatever they'd managed to squirrel away. No, I said. Frank stopped typing. No, Jerry. He stole $250,000. I turned around. The anger had left my face. What replaced it was something colder, something harder, the look of a man who is done reacting and has started calculating. No police, I said. Not yet. Why? Frank asked, genuinely bewildered. Because if I have him arrested right now, he still has hope. I said, moving back to the desk. He still thinks he's clever. He still thinks he's entitled to everything I built. I don't just want to punish him, Frank. I want to break him. I sat down and leaned forward, my eyes steady on Frank's. I want to take away the one thing he values more than the gambling, more than Vanessa. I want to take away his expectation. What do you mean? Frank asked. I mean, we are going to offer him a truce. I said, a grim smile finding the corners of my mouth. We're going to invite them to a meeting. We're going to tell them I'm exhausted, that I'm getting old, that I want to put all of this behind us. You want to settle? Frank asked, his voice climbing. After everything they did, I want to offer them a trust fund, I said. A substantial one, $2 million. Frank stared at me like I had taken a blow to the head, worse than the one Vanessa had given me. Jerry, have you gone senile? You want to hand the thief $2 million. I tapped the table with one finger. I want to show him $2 million. I want him to sign for it. I want him to believe he has won, that he has outsmarted the old man one more time. And then I want to watch him destroy himself with it. I pulled a notepad across the desk and picked up a pen. Draft a trust agreement, Frank. Make it airtight. But I want a clause in it. A hidden clause. A trigger that snaps the trap shut the moment he steps wrong. Frank looked at me and I watched the confusion on his face slowly give way to understanding. He saw the architecture of it. This wasn't mercy. It was total annihilation. You want to bait him, Frank said quietly. I want to see whether he's capable of redemption, I said. I was lying and we both knew it. I want to give him enough rope to hang himself, Frank. And I want the knot tied by his own greed. I looked down at the spreadsheet one final time. The figure $250,000 was burned into my mind. He had taken my past. I was going to take his future. Meet up the meeting, I said. Let's find out exactly how hungry they really are. The conference room in Frank's law firm was built to put people on edge. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the gray Philadelphia skyline. The table was long enough to park a vehicle on, and the air conditioning held the room at a brittle 65 degrees. I sat at the head of the table with my back to the view, Frank to my right. We were waiting. I had agreed to this meeting against my better judgment, or so I allowed them to believe. In reality, this room was the stage, and I had written every line of what was about to happen. I straightened my collar. It felt loose. I had dropped 5 LABs in 3 days. The stress of discovering my son was a criminal had burned away my appetite. The heavy glass doors swung open. Vanessa's attorney, a man named Drummond, who wore a suit 1 shade too shiny and a smile 1 degree too white, ushered them in. They had dressed for either a funeral or a court appearance. Vanessa, who usually draped herself in designer labels and saturated colors, was wearing a plain beige cardigan and slacks, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. No makeup, just the dark circles beneath her eyes on full display. It was a costume. She was playing the role of the remorseful, worn-down housewife. Derek followed her in, head down, shoulders caved. He looked like a man walking to the gallows, or perhaps one nursing a severe hangover. They took their seats at the far end of the table. The distance between us felt like miles. Mr. Callahan. Drummond began, his voice smooth and practiced. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. My clients are devastated by the events of Sunday evening. We are here in the spirit of healing, not conflict. I said nothing. I fixed my eyes on Vanessa and held them there. I wanted to see if she could hold my gaze. She couldn't. She looked down at the table, her hands working a tissue between her fingers. Vanessa, Drummond prompted gently. Vanessa drew an unsteady breath. Then the tears began, impressive tears, the kind that rolls silently down the cheeks, while the chin trembles on cue. Jerry, she whispered. I am so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I have been under enormous pressure with my parents losing everything and Derek's stress at work. I just snapped. That is not who I am. I listened to her sob about anxiety and stress. I listened to her describe the anger management counselor she had already scheduled. I listened to all of it, and the only thing running through my mind was the invoice for the Hermes bag she had purchased with my company's money. A bag that cost more than every counseling session she was lying about. And the money, Frank said, cutting cleanly through the emotional fog. We are not only here about the assault, Mr. Drummond. We are here about $250,000 in unauthorized withdrawals from Kowalski Construction. The room went stone silent. Vanessa's tears paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed with renewed intensity. Derek finally looked up. His face was the color of ash. It wasn't stealing, Derek said, his voice cracking. It was a loan, Dad. A temporary bridge loan. A bridge to where, Derek? I asked, my voice flat and dry. To a poker website. Derek flinched. You know about that. We know everything, Frank said, placing one hand on the thick file in front of him. We know about the shell companies. We know about the luxury purchases. We know about the gambling debts. This is embezzlement, Derek. We can stand up right now and hand this file to the district attorney. You will both be facing serious prison time. Drummond raised a palm. Let's not be hasty. My clients acknowledge that certain errors in judgment were made regarding corporate funds. They are prepared to make full restitution. With what money? I asked. Oh, they're broke. That's why they took it in the first place. We'll sign a promissory note, Derek said, jumping on the words eagerly. We will pay back every cent, Dad, with interest. We just need time. Please don't destroy our lives over money. We are family. I looked at the two of them. They were frightened, but they were not sorry. They were sorry they had been caught. They were bailing water, trying to keep the boat above the surface long enough to reach shore. It was time to play my hand. I let out a long, shuddering sigh. I let my shoulders sag. I pressed my fingers against my eyes and let my hand tremble visibly. I made myself look smaller, older, diminished, a man running out of fight. I'm tired, Frank, I said, my voice barely carrying across the table. Jerry, Frank said, playing his part with quiet precision. He looked genuinely concerned. I'm 70 years old. I went on, eyes cast down at the table. I built this company to take care of my family. And here I am, sitting in a conference room, talking about sending my own son to prison. I looked up at Derek. A flicker of hope moved across his face. Hachiku, I don't want to spend whatever years I have left in a courtroom, I said. I don't want the Callahan name dragged through the press. Derek said, leaning forward. I'll drop the charges, I said. Frank brought his hand down hard on the table. Jerry, you cannot be serious. They assaulted you. They stole $250,000. I waved it off. It's only money, Frank. And the cut on my forehead, it will heal. I turned my gaze to Vanessa. Her tears had stopped quite miraculously. She was watching me the way a hawk watches something small moving through the grass. I said, raising one finger. There are conditions. Anything, Derek said. Whatever you need. First, I want a full written confession regarding the money, signed and notarized, just for my own records so I know I'm not imagining things. Second, you will begin paying it back. $500 a month. I understand it will take a very long time, but the principle is what matters. Agreed, Drummond said immediately. Absolutely. And third, I said, letting the pause stretch. I've done some thinking this week. I've been holding on too tightly. I've been selfish, just like you said, Derek. I saw Derek wince at his own words being handed back to him, but he nodded along, encouraging. I want to make sure the future is secured, I said. I'm going to liquidate a portion of my personal assets, my bond portfolio. Vanessa's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She knew about the bonds. She knew what they were worth. I'm going to establish a trust fund, I announced, for my future grandchildren and for the two of you, so you never find yourselves in a position where you feel the need to steal again. I watched the look pass between Derek and Vanessa. It was electric. They thought I was surrendering. They thought they were looking at a senile old man trying to buy back their affection because he was afraid of dying alone. A trust fund. How much were you thinking, Jerry? Vanessa asked, her voice steady now. I leaned back and looked up at the ceiling. $2 million. The air went out of the room. $2 million. It was a fortune. It was freedom. It was the answer to every problem they had manufactured for themselves. I'll deposit the funds into an irrevocable trust, I explained. It will be managed by Frank. It will be there to support the family. Vanessa reached across the table and grabbed Derek's hand. She squeezed it hard. I could see the calculations running behind her eyes. She wasn't thinking about the assault anymore. She wasn't thinking about the shame, the criminal charges, any of it. She was thinking about the trips, the clothes, the lifestyle. She was thinking that she had won. That sounds wonderful, Dad, Derek said. Thank you. Thank you for forgiving us. I'm not doing it for you, I said. A lie. I'm doing it for the family name. So here is how this works, I said, sitting up slightly. Frank will draft the paperwork, the confession, the repayment plan, and the trust agreement. We reconvene here on Friday. You sign the confession. I sign the request to drop the criminal charges, and we execute the trust. We'll be there, Drummond said, snapping his notebook shut. Vanessa stood up. She was a different person from the woman who had walked in. The droop in her shoulders was gone. The energy was back. She looked at me, and for just a moment I caught a flash of triumph in her eyes. She thought she had broken me. She believed her violence had just earned her a $2 million payday. Thank you, Jerry, she said. You are doing the right thing. I watched them leave the room. Derek actually held the door open for her. They walked out with a lightness in their step, the walk of people who are already spending money in their heads. The door clicked shut. The silence came back. Frank looked at me. He dropped the act. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with the edge of his tie. You deserve an Oscar for that, Frank said, his voice dry. I didn't smile. I felt sick. I had just pledged a fortune to the people who had hurt me. Is the clause ready? I asked. Frank nodded. Addendum B, the forfeiture clause. It's buried in the legal language on page 42. If they commit a single crime, or if any past undeclared fraud surfaces after they sign the trust, dissolves, and every dollar goes to the charity of your choice. And the confession they're going to sign, I asked. Fully admissible, Frank said. If the trust gets voided, we can use their own signed confession to prosecute the embezzlement. Good. I stood and walked to the window. Down on the street below, Derek and Vanessa were coming out of the building. They were embracing, celebrating. They had no idea they were about to put their signatures on their own death warrant. They think it's a gift, I said quietly. Frank came and stood beside me. It isn't a gift, Jerry. It's a test. And they are going to fail it, I said. Because sharks don't stop swimming and thieves don't stop taking. They will slip. And when they do, I won't just have a shard of glass to show the judge. I'll have their signatures on a confession and a violated contract worth $2 million. Let them have their victory lap, I said, turning from the window. Friday is going to be a bloodbath. Friday came in on a gray, relentless drizzle that smeared the Philadelphia skyline into a wet blur of steel and concrete. Perfect weather for an execution. The condemned didn't know they were on death row, of course. They thought they were walking into a vault to collect a prize. I was already seated in the same leather chair when they arrived, both hands resting on a cane I had picked up at a drugstore that morning. I didn't need it. My knees were solid and my balance was fine. But the cane was a prop, a signal of frailty of a man who had run out of the will to fight. It was there to make them drop their guard. Frank sat to my right, still and composed. In the center of the table sat the document, the trust agreement, a thick stack of pages bound inside a blue legal folder. 2 inches of dense legal language standing between my son and $2 million. To Derek and Vanessa, that folder looked like a winning lottery ticket. To me, it looked like a bear trap buried under a fresh scatter of autumn leaves. The door opened and they came in. The shift in their bearing from the last meeting was almost offensive. The tears were gone. The modest clothing was gone. Vanessa had on a sharp blazer and her favorite pearl earrings. Derek had shaved and was wearing a tie. I recognized I had bought it for him 3 Christmases ago. They walked in with a bounce they were trying to tamp down, attempting to look sober and respectful. But the greed was radiating off them. They could smell the money. "Good morning, Dad." Derek said, his voice smooth and easy. He extended his hand. I took it. His palm was damp. "Good morning, son," I said, keeping my voice low and rough. "Thank you for coming." Vanessa sat down, her eyes going straight to the blue folder on the table. She ran her tongue briefly across her lower lip, a small automatic movement barely visible, but I caught it. It was the look of a predator that has just spotted something helpless. "We're just relieved we can put all of this behind us," Vanessa said. "We want to move forward, Jerry, as a family." I nodded slowly, releasing a heavy sigh. "That's all I want as well, Vanessa. Peace. I just want peace." Frank cleared his throat and drew the document toward him. He opened it with a crisp snap that rang through the quiet room. "As we discussed," Frank began, his tone purely professional, "this is the Gerald Callahan Irrevocable Family Trust. It is funded with a principal amount of $2 million liquidated from Mr. Callahan's municipal bond portfolio." I watched Derek's eyes when he heard the amount confirmed. $2 million. He was running the numbers in his head, calculating how many poker hands that could cover how many months of the life he wanted it could sustain. Frank continued, turning through the pages. "The structure is standard. The trust will provide a monthly stipend to the beneficiaries, Derek and Vanessa Callahan, for living expenses, medical costs, and upkeep of the family estate. The principal remains invested, and the dividends are substantial." "Excellent," Drummond said, beaming from his seat. He was almost certainly calculating his commission. "Everything appears to be in order. We have a few formalities to work through," Frank said. He turned to page 10. "Here we have the repayment agreement for the unauthorized corporate withdrawals. By signing, you acknowledge a debt of $250,000 to Kowalski Construction to be repaid through deductions from your monthly trust stipend across a period of 20 years. Derek waved a hand. Yes, we agreed to that. Deduct whatever you need." He didn't care. He was getting free money. Paying back what he'd stolen using funds I was handing him didn't register as a penalty. It felt like a wash. He was so eager to reach the signature page that he was barely processing the terms of his own repayment. Frank worked through more pages. He covered tax implications, trustee oversight, investment strategy. Derek and Vanessa nodded along, heads bobbing in sync, agreeing to everything and absorbing nothing. They were bored. They wanted the check. "And finally," Frank said, coming to a stop at page 42, "we have Addendum B." I leaned forward slightly, resting my chin on my hands folded over the top of the cane. This was the moment. The kill shot. Frank settled his glasses. "This is the conduct clause. It is standard in trusts of this magnitude to protect the principal from misuse. It states that all beneficiaries must remain in good standing with the law." Vanessa gave a light laugh, a small tinkling sound. "Well, we're certainly not planning to rob any banks." Frank did not smile. "The clause specifies that if any beneficiary is convicted of a crime, misdemeanor, or felony against the grantor or his estate, their interest in the trust is immediately and permanently revoked. Furthermore, and this is the critical point, if any past fraudulent financial activity not previously disclosed to the grantor comes to light after this document is executed, the trust is voided retroactively and all funds revert to a charitable remainder." It was a wall of legalese. It was designed to sound tedious. It was engineered to read like the kind of boilerplate that lawyers insert to justify their billable hours. Derek glanced at the page. The text was dense, single-spaced, unbroken. He didn't read it. He looked at the clock on the wall instead, probably already thinking about where they'd go for lunch. Standard stuff, Derek said. Good standing. Got it. Where do we sign? My heart hammered against my ribs. He didn't ask what qualified as fraudulent activity. He didn't ask whether the conduct covered things he'd already done, but hadn't yet admitted to. He assumed that because I was establishing the trust, I had forgiven everything. He assumed the ledger had been cleared. He didn't understand that I wasn't clearing anything. I was sealing the evidence in place, preserved intact, permanent. Right here, Frank said, tapping the signature line at the foot of the page. And your initials on every page, please. Derek lifted the pen. It was heavy and expensive fountain pen, the kind with weight to it. He uncapped it. The scratch of the nib dragging across paper was sharp in the quiet. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He signed his name. Derek Callahan. Then he pushed the document across to Vanessa. She didn't pause. She didn't read a single word. She signed with a sweeping flourish, looping her letters like she was putting her name on a theater program. They slid the document back to Frank. Done, Derek said, easing back in his chair with a long, satisfied exhale. I studied the signatures. They were clean, complete. They had just put their names on a contract that said in plain terms, if I caught them doing anything else wrong, or if I uncovered anything they had already done, they lost everything. And the beauty of it was that I already knew about the things they hadn't confessed to. I knew about the safety deposit box registered under Vanessa's maiden name. I knew about the second set of books Derek maintained for his off-the-books jobs. I was simply waiting for the ink to cure before I used it. Frank closed the folder. Congratulations, he said, his voice flat as slate. The trust is now active. Derek rose from his chair and crossed the room toward me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy, like a yoke. Thanks, Dad, he said. You won't regret this. We're going to make you proud. I looked up at him. I looked into the eyes of the boy I had raised, the boy who had grown into a thief. I know, Derek, I said, keeping my voice soft. I know exactly what you are going to do. Vanessa came over and wrapped her arms around me in a stiff, rehearsed embrace. She smelled of expensive perfume bought with my money. I'll see you Sunday for dinner, she said. We can celebrate. I'm not up to dinner this week, I said, gripping the cane. I need to rest. I need to recover. Of course, she said, drawing back. Take all the time you need. We're here for you. They walked out. Mr. Drummond shook hands with Frank and fell in behind them. I could hear them laughing in the hallway. I heard Derek say, "Drinks are on me." The door clicked shut. I sat in the stillness for a long moment. The silence of that room settled around me like a coat. I let the cane drop to the floor with a deliberate clatter. I straightened in my seat, the frailty dissolving from my posture all at once. I rolled my shoulders, shaking loose the tension I had been carrying for the past hour. I looked over at Frank. He was already locking the blue folder inside his briefcase. They didn't even read it, Frank said, shaking his head. They didn't read Addendum B. Greed blinds you, Frank, I said, rising and moving to the window. When you are staring straight into the sun, you cannot see the cliff you're walking toward. Frank snapped the briefcase locks shut. So what now? The trust is active. They have access to the first stipend next month. Now, I said, looking down at the street where Derek and Vanessa were spilling out of the building, high-fiving each other on the sidewalk. Now we wait for them to get comfortable. We wait for them to spend a little of it. We wait for them to believe they are untouchable. I watched them climb into a cab. They looked so happy. They looked so certain they had won. Then I said it, my voice dropping to a whisper colder than the Philadelphia wind. We pull the rug. I turned back to Frank. Do you have the surveillance team positioned for tonight? Frank nodded. They're parked outside the motel. They'll stay on them everywhere. Good, I said, because Derek had money in his pocket now, and a gambler holding cash is a fuse that's already been lit. He wouldn't be able to stop himself. He'd end up at the casino, or he'd call his bookie, or he'd try to bury one of the old problems he believed I knew nothing about. I picked up my coat. The countdown has started, Frank, I said. Let's go. I have a feeling tonight is going to be very interesting. The witching hour is usually 3 in the morning, but in my house the demons showed up at 2:15. I was not asleep. Sleep had been a stranger to me from the moment I understood that my own family was a nest of vipers. I was sitting in the dark of my study, the only light a pale wash from the street lamp outside bleeding through the heavy velvet curtains. I was waiting. Frank's surveillance team had reached me 2 hours earlier. They reported that Derek had left the motel in a rental car, driving erratically, making a stop at a bar known for hosting the kind of men who break kneecaps professionally and then heading straight for here. I knew he was coming. I knew exactly why. The trust we had all signed 3 days prior was a promise of future wealth. But Derek had present tense problems. Sharks don't care about future dividends. They care about blood in the water right now. I heard the car roll up the driveway. He cut the engine before he reached the garage, trying to move quietly. It was pathetic. The crunch of gravel under the tires was as loud as a gunshot in the suburban silence. Then the footsteps came slow, careful, creeping toward the back door. I sat perfectly still in my wingback leather chair. Across my lap rested my old Mossberg 500 shotgun. It was not loaded. I would never shoot my own son, no matter how richly he had earned it. But Derek didn't know it was empty. And fear is a far more powerful instrument than buckshot. I heard the jingle of keys. He was working the back door, the one that led to the mudroom. I heard the key slide into the lock, then the confusion. He jiggled the handle. He cursed under his breath. He was using the key I had given him 10 years ago, the key to the home he had grown up in. He had no idea that key was now useless metal. He had no idea that Sal the locksmith had turned this house into a fortress. He tried again, harder, grinding the key against the tumblers. It wouldn't budge. Panic makes people stupid. If he'd been thinking clearly, he would have turned around and walked away. He would have understood that a changed lock meant I knew. But he wasn't thinking. He was desperate. I heard him shift to the left toward the kitchen window. I knew that window. The latch had always been sticky. It was the weak point. Then came the sound I had been bracing for. The crash. It wasn't a clean break. He must have used a rock from the garden, or maybe the tire iron. The glass gave way with a violence that made me flinch, even though I had anticipated it. Shards rang out across the tile floor, and the sound carried through the whole house. I stayed in the chair. I controlled my breathing. In, out. In, out. I heard him pulling himself through the frame. I heard the grunt of effort as he hauled himself over the sill. His shoe crunched down on the broken glass. He was inside. My son, the CEO of my company, the beneficiary of a $2 million trust, was now officially a burglar. A felon. He had just triggered the forfeiture clause of the document he hadn't bothered to read. The money was gone. The future was gone. But he didn't know that yet. He moved fast now. He didn't head upstairs toward the bedrooms. He came straight down the hall toward the study. He knew precisely where the value was concentrated. He wasn't after cash. He knew I no longer kept large sums in the house. He was coming for the display case. The study door eased open. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the bookshelves, the desk, the Persian rug. He didn't swing it into my corner. He was locked onto the cabinet against the far wall, the one that held my watch collection. I watched him from the shadows. He looked manic, sweating, his hair matted flat against his forehead. He rushed the cabinet and knocked in the glass front with the butt of the flashlight. He was past caring about noise. He grabbed the Patek Philippe Calatrava first, then the vintage Rolex Submariner. Those two pieces alone were worth $80,000 on the gray market, enough to settle a great deal of debt, enough to keep his legs attached to his body. He was jamming them into his pockets, his hands trembling so badly he nearly lost the Rolex. He was muttering to himself, just get it, and go. I let him fill his pockets. I let him believe he'd gotten away with it. I let him turn to go. Then I reached over and clicked the switch on the brass lamp beside my chair. Light flooded the room, harsh, sudden, merciless. Derek froze. He spun around, eyes wide, pupils blown open with terror. He saw me. He saw what was in my face. And then he saw the shotgun resting across my knees, the barrel pointed loosely his way. He made a sound that wasn't quite a scream. It was a strangled, airless gasp of pure fear. He dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor beam, spinning wildly before it came to rest against the leg of the desk. "Dad," he whispered. "Don't. Please." I didn't move the gun. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the flat calm of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Put them back," I said. Derek was trembling so hard his teeth had begun to chatter. "Dad, listen to me. I can explain. Just put them back." He scrambled to the cabinet. He pulled the watches from his pockets and set them down on the shelf beside the shattered glass. He raised both hands, surrendering. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want this. I had no choice." "There is always a choice, Derek," I said. "You chose to break into my home. You chose to steal from me again after I gave you everything, after I signed the trust. The trust isn't enough." He screamed, his composure finally shattering. "They won't wait for the monthly stipend. They need the money now." "Tuhut," I asked. "Who owns you, Derek?" He collapsed, dropping straight to his knees on the floor. He buried his face in his hands and wept like a child. "The Albanians," he choked out. "The guys running the poker site. I owe them 50 grand. They said if I didn't pay by tomorrow, they'd come for me. They said they would hurt Vanessa." I looked at him with contempt. "So you decided to hurt me instead. You decided to rob your own father to pay off thugs." "I was going to buy them back," he cried, looking up at me, his face slicked with tears and snot. "I swear, once the trust money started coming in, I was going to buy the watches back and slip them into the case. You never would have known." I laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "I would have known, Derek. I always know. And now, thanks to the document you signed on Friday, you have lost the trust as well. You broke the law. You broke the contract. It is over." Derek's face drained white. "No. No, you can't. You can't take it away. We need that money. We have plans. Vanessa has plans." He was unraveling, terrified of the loan sharks. Terrified of me, terrified of losing the life he believed he was owed. I reached for the phone on the side table. "I'm calling the police, Derek. This is burglary. This is the end." "No," he shrieked. He began crawling toward me on his knees. "Dad, please. You don't understand. Vanessa will kill me. She told me to do whatever it took. She said we deserved it. She said..." He stopped. He caught himself. He realized he'd said too much. His mouth clamped shut, his eyes darting around the room. "Hun," she said, "what Derek?" I asked, leaning forward slightly, the gun shifting on my lap. "What did your wife say?" "So nothing," he stammered. "She was just angry." "Tell me," I commanded, "or I call the police right now and tell them you came in armed." Derek looked at the phone. He looked at the gun. He looked at the wreckage of his life. "She said it wouldn't matter if I took the watches." He whispered, a horror entering his voice that I hadn't heard before. "She said you wouldn't notice. She said you wouldn't be around much longer to miss them anyway." The room went cold. Colder than the night air pushing through the broken window. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Why wouldn't I be around?" Derek stared down at the floor, shaking his head, tears falling onto the Persian rug. "She said your health is failing, Dad. She said you've been getting dizzy lately. She said nature is taking its course faster than you think." My hand went still on the phone. Dizzy. I had been getting dizzy, headaches too. I had told myself it was stress. I had told myself it was blood pressure. But how did Vanessa know? Why was she so certain? A dark and terrible shape began forming at the back of my mind. It wasn't nature. It wasn't age. Derek. I said, my voice barely a sound. "Why am I getting dizzy?" He didn't answer. He just sobbed. "Derek!" I roared, rising from the chair, the shotgun clattering to the floor. "What did she do?" He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw something far worse than theft. I saw the reflection of a murder. "The soup," he whispered. "It's in the soup." The words hung in the air like poison. "It's in the soup." I looked at my son curled on my Persian rug, sobbing into his hands. A moment ago, he was a burglar. Now he was something that didn't have a clean name. The silence in the room was total. The wind moaning through the broken window seemed to stop. The grandfather clock ticking in the hallway seemed to slow. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. And this time I knew it was not only fear. It was the understanding that the illness I had been fighting for months was not natural. "Stand," I said. My voice was no longer a father's voice. It was an interrogator's. Derek shook his head, pressing his face deeper into the carpet. "See, I can't. I can't." "Stand up," I roared, the words bouncing off the walls. Derek scrambled upright, retreating until his back hit the display cabinet. He glanced at the shotgun on the floor, then back at me. He looked like a cornered animal. "What is in the soup, Derek?" I said, taking a step toward him. "You said she told you I wouldn't be around much longer. You said nature was taking its course, but it was not nature. Was it?" Derek was hyperventilating, his chest pumping in short, ragged heaves. "Dad, please. I didn't know at first, I swear. She just said she was giving you supplements. She said you needed help relaxing. She said your heart was bad and you needed the medicine." "My heart is strong as a bull," I said, holding his gaze. "I have never had a heart condition in my life." "What kind of medicine, Derek?" He wiped his nose on his sleeve, leaving a damp streak. "Sedatives," he whispered. And blood thinners." I felt the room tilt. I reached out and gripped the back of the leather chair to hold myself steady. For the past 6 months, I had been plagued by dizzy spells. I had woken in the dead of night, disoriented, my limbs heavy as lead. I had gone to my doctor 3 times reporting fatigue and vertigo. He had run tests. He had found nothing wrong, chalking it up to age and stress. He had told me to eat better, so I did. I ate the meals my loving daughter-in-law prepared for me. The potato leek soup. I said, the memory flooding back. Every Sunday, she insisted on making me potato leek soup. She said it was good for my digestion. Derek nodded, tears running freely again. She crushed the pills into a powder. She mixed it in the kitchen before she brought the bowl out. She said it would just make you sleepy. She said if you were tired, you wouldn't ask so many questions about the money. I looked at him and I recognized the lie he was feeding himself. He wanted to believe it was only to make me sleep. But we both knew the truth. And the blood thinners, I said, my voice dropping to something deadly quiet. Why the blood thinners, Derek? He squeezed his eyes shut. She said old people fall. She said if you fell and your blood was thin, it would happen faster. You would just go to sleep and not wake up. It would look like an accident, a stroke, a hemorrhage. I remembered last month, walking down the stairs to the basement. A sudden wave of dizziness rolling through me without warning, the world spinning. My hand catching the railing at the last possible second, knuckles turning white as I hung there gasping. If I had gone down 12 concrete steps, blood that couldn't clot, I would have bled out on that cold floor before anyone found me. They were not waiting for me to die. They were actively killing me. You tried to murder me, I whispered. My own flesh and blood. You pulled up a chair at my table, poured yourself my wine, and sat there night after night while your wife worked poison into my food. I didn't do it, Derek shrieked, his voice splitting at the seams. It was all her. I begged her to quit. I said it was going too far. But she kept saying we couldn't wait around for the inheritance. Said you were too damn healthy. Said you'd outlive us both and we'd be gray and stooped before we ever got a cent. And you stood by and let it happen, I said. You had a phone. You knew my number. Instead, you kept quiet and watched me get sicker. When I was scared of her. He sobbed. You have no idea what she's capable of when she turns on you. She runs everything. Every decision, every move, it's all her. That makes you a coward, I said, the revulsion climbing my throat. A gutless, contemptible coward. A man who'd sooner put his father in the ground than face down his own wife. My gaze drifted through the open doorway to the dining room, where the soup tureen sat on the sideboard, a gift they had brought last Christmas, smiling as they set it down. A delivery vehicle for poison. Something crystallized inside me in that instant. Every piece snapped into focus. The months of fog burned away. The headaches, the bruises that lingered for weeks, the spells of vertigo that my doctor could never explain. None of it was my body giving out. Someone was engineering my death. I moved to the desk and lifted the receiver. What do you think you're doing? Derek asked, scrambling to his feet. Dad, wait. We can pull back from this. I'll give them everything, every name, every detail. Just keep me out of it. I'm as much a victim as you are. I lowered the phone and fixed him with a look. A victim. That's what you think you are. You're an accomplice, Derek. And as of tonight, a self-confessed one. I pressed the 3 digits, 911. Derek surged forward. For a heartbeat, I braced for impact. Thought he might actually finish what Vanessa had set in motion, but his legs gave out, and he buckled onto the floor a yard short of the desk, folding into himself. He understood there was no road out of this. No argument defeats a man who raised entire skylines with his bare hands. 911, what is your emergency? A woman's voice, measured and professional. I breathed in slowly. When I spoke, my voice carried no tremor. It was the voice of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. My name is Gerald Callahan. My address is 318 Winmore Lane. I am reporting a break-in. The intruder is on the ground and secured. Sir, are you hurt? Is the intruder carrying a weapon? I glanced over at Derek, hunched and weeping. I looked at the gaping hole where the window used to be. I looked at the bare pegs in the watch cabinet. "No weapon," I said. "But I need detectives on scene, not just patrol officers. Senior detectives." "Can you tell me why, sir?" "Because what I'm reporting goes beyond a break-in," I said, staring at the crown of my son's skull. "I have a recorded confession. My son and his wife have been administering poison to me over a period of months. This is attempted murder. Silence on the line." Then the dispatcher's tone sharpened like a blade. "Units are being dispatched now, sir. Please remain on the line and do not hang up." I held the receiver and didn't move. I stood watching the boy I'd once taught to bait a hook, the child I had carried on my shoulders, the person I had placed above everything else in this world. He was hollowed out, finished. Out in the distance, the first siren started a thin climbing wail threading through the quiet streets. And standing there, I understood something with absolute clarity. The poison was never just in the bowl of soup. It had been growing for years in the greed, in the sense of entitlement, in the rot that had quietly consumed the family I had given everything to build. Another wave of dizziness rolled through me. This time I didn't grab for support. I planted my feet. I straightened my spine. I would not go down. Not to them. Not tonight. I would be alive to watch them walk into a courtroom in orange. I would see justice done, and at first light I was going to empty every container of food in this house into the sink. The cruisers arrived in a blaze of red and blue, their lights strobing across the walls of the front room in a frantic, lurching rhythm. It had the look of a celebration in hell. Officer Novak came through the door, the same young officer who'd written up my statement after the hospital visit. But he was no longer the lead man in the room. Detective Reyes had taken up position in the center of my study. Square-jawed, unhurried, with the kind of eyes that have absorbed decades of the worst people do to one another and stopped flinching long ago. I stood at the desk, shoulders back, the last of the adrenaline cooling into something harder and quieter. I extended the USB stick from the security system toward him. "Everything that happened tonight is on that drive," I said. "The point of entry, the smashed cabinet, the theft attempt property worth north of $80,000. But that footage is almost secondary." Reyes studied me. "Almost secondary?" I pulled out my phone. The recording was already cued. I hit play. Derek's sobbing filled the room, small, ragged, unmistakable. Then my own voice cutting through it. "What is in the soup, Derek?" And his answer, the one that sealed everything. "Sedatives, blood thinners." She said it would look like an accident. Not a sound in that room. Even the officers near the door went still. The only noise was the uneven breathing of my son, still on the floor, a uniform posted at each shoulder. Reyes let the full recording run. His expression never shifted. When it ended, he looked down at Derek, the way a surgeon looks at a wound, clinical, unsentimental, faintly weary. "Get him on his feet," Reyes said. The two officers hauled Derek upright. He offered nothing, arms, slack head hanging a puppet with severed strings. His gaze stayed welded to the floor as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. That sound. Clean, final, irreversible. A gavel with a lock on it. "Dispatch Reyes." He keyed his radio. "Male subject is in custody at the scene. Revise the charge sheet. We're charging conspiracy to commit first-degree murder ad burglary." "Understood." Dispatch came back. "Unit 3 is holding at the motel. Female subject is in custody." I kept listening. The radio opened again a moment later. "Detective, you'll want this. We went through the room. Bathroom vanity, we've got a cache of unlabeled pill bottles, contents crushed to powder. And there's a notebook. Say again a notebook, Reyes asked. Affirmative, spiral bound. Cover reads, dosage for Jerry. Inside dates quantities which dish the material was mixed into. Entries run back 6 months. Something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the night air flooding the broken window. A record. They hadn't simply been poisoning me. They had logged it. Columns and entries, careful notation, the same discipline I once brought to reading soil surveys before breaking ground on a building. They had turned the business of killing me into paperwork. That notebook wasn't evidence of a crime. It was evil with a filing system. That wraps it up, Reyes said. Bring the woman in. I watched Derek being walked out through the doorway. He drifted past me, trailing the sour smell of fear and sweat. He slowed by a half step. I could see him searching for something to say, some plea, some last appeal, but he caught my expression and thought better of it. He moved on. Frank came up the front walk, just as the officers were steering Derek down the porch steps. My lawyers absorbed the scene in one sweep, the cuffs, the cruisers angled across the driveway, me standing at the threshold. He didn't ask. He'd already read the picture. I stepped off the porch to meet him. The rain had cleared off, leaving the night air sharp and biting. It's over, Frank, I said, keeping my voice low. 6 months they were dosing me. The color left Frank's face in one pull. He looked like a man who'd just been struck. My God, Jerry, I'm so sorry. Save it, I said. What I need from you right now is the contract. Execute it. Frank reached into his coat for his phone without another word. He knew exactly what I meant. Addendum B, I said. Trigger the forfeiture clause, now. His thumb moved across the screen. Done, he said. Formal notice is away to the trustee. The Gerald Callahan Family Trust is hereby void. $2 million clawed back from the beneficiaries forfeited the moment a felony was committed against the grantor. And the money? I asked. Across the driveway, an officer was guiding Derek's head down as he folded him into the rear of the cruiser. Goes to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, Frank said. Exactly as written. Good. Let it go to children who actually want to live, not to adults who wanted me dead. Down the block, a second set of flashing lights was turning the corner. The unit transporting Vanessa from the motel to the station. As the car moved past my house, I caught her face through the rear window. She wasn't weeping. She was screaming. Her features contorted into something ugly, her mouth going at the glass that held the world at bay. She was still fighting. She still believed she could charm or rage her way out of what was coming. She didn't yet understand that her own logbook had already written her ending. The neighbors had materialized by now. Mrs. Waverly stood on her lawn in her bathrobe, one hand pressed flat against her sternum. The young couple next door hovered behind their blinds. They were watching the collapse of the house of Callahan. They would be dining on this story for years. They would murmur about the old man and the children who turned on him. Let them. I watched both cruisers roll away, their taillights shrinking into the dark, carrying off the last poisonous remnants of everything I had endured. I stood on that porch for a long while. I checked my own pulse. Steady. I pulled a slow breath into my chest. My lungs were clear. I was standing. I was alone, yes, but I was standing. And for the first time in 6 months, the dizziness was gone. In its place was something I had almost forgotten the feel of. Strength. I did not cry. Tears belonged to loss, and I had lost nothing tonight. I had taken out the trash. It has been exactly 365 days since those taillights disappeared from my driveway. The quiet that moved in afterward has been the loudest thing I have ever lived through. People say time heals. What I have found is that time is less a healer and more a demolition crew. It clears the wreckage so you can pour a new foundation, and I have been building ever since. The trial was a production, precisely the kind of spectacle Vanessa had always hungered for, though I suspect she found the final act less to her liking. The judge was not moved by the tears. He wasn't buying the narrative about stress or the claims that her parents had manipulated her into it. The evidence left no room for any of that. The dosage logbook was the coffin lid. I sat in the front row every morning and watched her come apart session by session. When the gavel landed 15 years in a maximum security federal prison for attempted murder and conspiracy, she didn't scream. She simply folded into her chair, emptied out a hollow version of the woman who once believed she was clever enough to outmaneuver a man who had built skyscrapers with his hands. Derek was a different matter. True to form, he buckled the moment the pressure was applied. He made a deal. He sat on the stand and gave them everything, every scheme, every plan, every late-night conversation about how and when I would go. He handed her over completely, trying to save himself. The judge gave him 8 years, a leniency he had not earned. But watching them lead him away in handcuffs, his face wet, weeping not for what he had done, but for what it was going to cost him, I felt no satisfaction. What I felt was closure. He turned to look at me one last time before the side door took him. I held his gaze. I didn't raise a hand, didn't say a word. I gave him a single, slow nod. A nod that meant goodbye to the son I believed I was raising, and goodbye to the criminal he chose to become instead. As for the Dunbars, Wayne and Connie, karma arrived in the form of a tax audit. It turns out that concealing $600,000 in cash, proceeds from a property sale, tends to attract attention from the IRS. The agency took everything. The accounts, the buried assets, and yes, that brand new $400,000 luxury RV they had been so proud of. Last I heard, they were living out of a rusted 20-year-old camper in a public lot on the outskirts of Orlando, getting by on Social Security and the charity of people who didn't know the full story. They wanted the open road. Now it's all they have. When the legal machinery finally went quiet, I turned back to the house. That Victorian mansion, the one I had bled time and money and love into over decades, no longer felt like mine. It felt like a crime scene wearing a familiar face. Every room carried something I didn't want to carry anymore. The dining room where the wine glass had shattered against my skull. The study where they'd gone at the safe. The kitchen where the soup was mixed and measured and poisoned. I couldn't pull a breath in there without tasting it. So I sold it. No negotiating, no waiting for a better moment in the market. I sold it to a young family who knew nothing of what had happened within those walls. People who would bring children and noise and ordinary happiness into it and crowd out whatever remained. The proceeds from that sale were considerable. Combined with the bonds released from the dissolved trust, I had accumulated more than I could reasonably spend across multiple lifetimes. But I was finished stockpiling wealth for people who viewed it as something owed to them. I wanted to construct something with a longer shelf life than real estate. Something that would outlast me in ways that mattered. 6 months ago, I cut the ribbon on the Gerald Callahan Woodworking Center. It sits in one of the harder parts of the city, the kind of block where young people grow up believing their choices begin and end with the street. The facility is first-rate. We run courses in carpentry, cabinetry, and structural engineering. But those are just the surface courses. What we are really teaching is discipline, the understanding that what you earn with your hands belongs to you in a way that nothing handed to you ever does. Respect for the work, for the tools, for one another. I'm there every day. Not as a figurehead, not as the name above the door. I am the head instructor. I stand at the bench and look out at those faces, young men and women, who have been handed almost nothing and I see an appetite for something real that Derek never once showed me. When I guide a 19-year-old through planing a piece of oak until it lies perfectly flat and smooth, I see something ignite behind their eyes that no dollar figure can replicate. They call me Mr. B. When I speak, they lean in. When I correct them, they say thank you. They are not my blood. But in the sawdust and the racket of that workshop, they have become my people. They are the inheritance I was always meant to leave behind. Now I am a long way from the noise of Philadelphia. I'm on the porch of a small log cabin in Montana looking out over a lake so still it reads like a mirror laid flat on the earth. The air has an edge to it carrying pine and wood smoke. It is uncomplicated here. A one-bedroom cabin I built myself over the summer. No east wing, no marble underfoot, no hidden cameras tucked into the corners. Just a wood fire, and the kind of quiet you can trust. The sun is going down behind the peaks, pulling streaks of purple and gold across the sky. I reach for the bottle sitting beside me on the table. A Cabernet, a vintage, close to the one that was thrown in my face that Easter Sunday. But tonight, the wine is not a weapon. It is something closer to a sacrament. I pour a glass. The wine moves slowly, catching what's left of the light. I hold the glass up and look through it. I think about the marks, that the stitches left on my forehead now faded to pale, quiet lines. I think about the chair at the table that sits empty. A brief ache passes through me, soft and shapeless, for what might have existed between a father and his son. Then it passes. What takes its place is something steadier, relief clean and deep. I am free of it. No more bracing for the next fabrication. No more fielding requests dressed up as love. No more lying awake wondering whether I would see morning. I lift my glass toward the horizon, where the first stars are beginning to press through. I think of my late wife, a woman who kept flowers and avoided confrontation, and would have wept over all of this. She would have been wounded by what happened. But I know with equal certainty that she would have respected how I brought it to an end. She had no patience for weeds. She understood that if you want the garden to breathe, sometimes you have to get on your knees and pull the roots out completely. My love, I say quietly into the cold mountain air. I did it. I cleaned house. The weeds are gone. The garden is safe. I take a sip. Dark cherries, oak, and something that tastes like the far end of a very long road. I settle back into the rocking chair and let the wind in the pines do the talking. For the first time in longer than I can account for, I am not Gerald the provider, or Gerald the target, or Gerald the bank account with a heartbeat. I am just Gerald. And that is enough. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. This one wasn't easy to tell, and I suspect it wasn't easy to hear. Looking back on everything that unfolded, the glass thrown at Easter, the fabricated poverty, the embezzlement, and finally that logbook with my name on the cover, what strikes me most is how long I ignored what was plainly in front of me. I wanted to believe in the family I thought I had. That hope cost me 6 months of my health and nearly cost me everything. I believe God kept me on my feet long enough to see the truth, and that the timing of when it all broke open was not an accident. Here is what I would tell any father, any parent who finds themselves in a version of this story. Love your children fiercely, but never confuse love with silence. Letting harm go unchallenged is not kindness. It is surrender. Document everything before you act. Emotion is a poor substitute for evidence when the stakes are this high. If someone's story about their life doesn't hold up to a single honest question, stop funding it. Charity that enables deception is not charity. And when the people closest to you show you who they are, believe them the first time. The second time is always worse. These are the kinds of father stories that don't make it to the dinner table, but they need to be heard. Because family justice doesn't happen on its own. It requires someone willing to stand up, keep their nerve, and see it through to the end. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs the reminder that it is never too late to reclaim your dignity. Leave a comment below. I want to know what stayed with you. And if you haven't already, subscribing to Alpha Dad Stories means the next one will find you when it's ready. Take care of yourself. I'll talk to you soon.